It started like any other quiet morning in the small town of Maplewood. The sun had barely risen, casting a golden hue over the sleepy streets, and most people were just beginning to stir. But for one stray dog, the day had already begun with a sense of urgency. This wasn't just any dog. He was scrappy, lean, and had the kind of eyes that told 1,000 stories. He had no collar, no name, and no home, but today he had a mission. Residents of the town had seen him before, darting between alleys or sniffing around the local diner in hopes of a kind soul tossing him scraps. But this morning, he was acting strangely. Instead of aimlessly wandering, he ran with purpose, barking loudly, trying to get someone, anyone, to follow him. He weaved through the streets, his paws kicking up dust as he rushed toward the outskirts of town, where the woods met the old country road. People who saw him thought nothing of it at first, just a stray being a stray. But then, he did something that made even the most distracted passersby take notice. He stopped in front of a gas station, panting heavily, his tail wagging anxiously as he barked at a group of workers unloading a truck. It wasn't the usual bark of a dog begging for food or attention. It was urgent, desperate even. He looked them in the eye, then turned and ran a few feet, only to stop and bark again. It was as if he was pleading with them, trying to say something. When they didn't follow, he let out a sharp, almost frustrated whine before rushing to the next person in sight, a woman walking her morning route. Again, he barked, ran a few steps away, then turned back, waiting. Something about his persistence made the woman pause. She had seen dogs act oddly before, but this was different. This wasn't just excitement or playfulness. This was a cry for help. She hesitated for a moment before deciding to follow. And as she did, a few more people took notice. A couple of bystanders, a man getting out of his truck, and even the gas station workers, now curious, found themselves drawn to the dog's frantic energy. One by one, they trailed behind him as he led them away from the town, away from the safety of the streets, and toward the thick brush beyond the roadside ditch. As they followed him into the overgrown path, an uneasy feeling settled in. The air felt different here, thicker, quieter. The group exchanged nervous glances, unsure what they were walking into. The dog, however, never hesitated. He darted ahead, his ears alert, his tail stiff with determination. And then, just as suddenly as he had started this mysterious journey, he stopped. The ditch was deep, lined with mud and tangled branches, the kind of place most people wouldn't think twice about. But as they stepped closer, peering over the edge, their breath caught in their throats. A single moment stretched into eternity as the reality of what they were seeing sank in. What lay at the bottom of that ditch would change everything. The group stood frozen at the edge of the ditch, their hearts pounding. The dog whimpered softly, pacing back and forth, his eyes never leaving the bottom. The morning light barely reached through the tangled branches, casting eerie shadows over the scene. Someone took a hesitant step forward, leaning in for a better look. And that's when they saw it, a small, motionless figure partially hidden by the undergrowth. For a moment, no one spoke. The air felt too thick, the silence pressing against their chests. Then, the woman who had followed the dog first let out a sharp breath. "Is that?" she started, but the words caught in her throat. One of the men quickly pulled out his phone, switching on the flashlight to cut through the dim light. The beam landed on the figure, revealing more details. A torn piece of clothing, a hand curled slightly in the dirt. It was unmistakably human. Someone gasped. The dog let out another urgent bark, his tail flicking anxiously. He looked up at the group, as if demanding them to do something. The woman took a cautious step closer. "Hello," she called out, her voice shaky. "Can you hear me?" No response. Her heart pounded harder. This was no longer just a strange morning with a stray dog. This was something far more serious. She turned to the others, her eyes wide. "We need to get down there." The ditch was steep and slippery, but that didn't stop two of the men from carefully making their way down. The mud clung to their shoes as they moved, their breathing heavy with nerves. The dog whined, pacing at the top as he watched them descend. As they got closer, The figure became clearer. It was a child. A young girl, no older than 10. Her clothes were dirty, her hair matted, and her face pale. She wasn't moving. One of the men crouched beside her, gently touching her shoulder. "Hey, kid," he said softly. "Can you hear me?" Nothing. He felt a sinking weight in his stomach. He turned his head and looked at the others above. "She's breathing," he called out, relief washing over his voice. "But she's weak." The woman covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes welling up. "Oh my God." The man carefully lifted the girl into his arms. Her body was limp, her skin cool. She barely reacted. He climbed back up with the help of another man, both struggling against the slippery incline. When they finally reached the top, the girl stirred slightly, letting out a soft sound, barely a whisper. The dog pressed close, sniffing at her, his tail wagging faintly. It was clear now. He had been trying to get help for her all along. "Someone call 911, a voice said urgently. Another person was already dialing. "We found a child," he told the operator. "She's alive, but she needs help." The dog sat beside the girl, watching her intently, as if making sure she was safe now. "How long do you think she's been out here?" someone asked. No one had an answer, but looking at the state she was in, her torn clothes, the dirt streaked across her face, it had to have been a while. The group waited, the seconds stretching endlessly. The dog refused to move from the girl's side, his watchful eyes flicking between her and the people around them. Finally, in the distance, the sound of sirens cut through the silence. The woman who had first followed the dog let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Help was on the way, but the real questions were just beginning. Who was this girl? How had she ended up here? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, was someone looking for her? The ambulance arrived within minutes, red and blue lights flashing across the trees as paramedics rushed to the girl's side. The group of bystanders stepped back, giving them space, but their eyes never left the child. The woman who had followed the dog first felt her stomach twist as she watched them check her pulse, shine a small light in her eyes, and press a stethoscope to her chest. The girl stirred weakly but still didn't speak. The dog sat protectively by her side, his ears perked, his body tense. He had led them here, but his job wasn't done. He was still watching, still waiting. One of the paramedics looked up. "She's severely dehydrated. Probably hasn't eaten in a while either." He turned to the police officer who had just arrived. "She needs to get to the hospital immediately." The officer nodded, already scanning the group of bystanders. "Does anyone know who she is?" A silence followed. People exchanged looks, but no one spoke up. The town was small. Everyone knew everyone. But this girl, she didn't look familiar. Her face was too pale, her features drawn with exhaustion. But even so, someone should have recognized her. "No one's seen her before," a man finally said. "She's not from around here." The officer frowned, glancing back at the child. No missing reports have come in that match her description. That sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. If no one had reported her missing, who was she? And why was she out here alone? The paramedics carefully lifted the girl onto a stretcher. The dog let out a low whine and tried to follow, but one of the responders gently held up a hand. "Whoa there, buddy. You can't come with us." The dog barked once, as if protesting, but didn't move from his spot. The woman watching felt a strange pang in her chest. He had led them here, and now he was being left behind. She stepped forward. "Wait, maybe you should come." The officer turned to her. "What?" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "He's the reason we found her. He led us here. That can't be a coincidence." The officer studied the dog, then nodded. "All right, we'll take him in for now." The dog didn't resist as they gently guided him into the back of a patrol car. His eyes never left the girl as the ambulance doors shut and the vehicle sped away. The crowd slowly began to break apart, murmuring among themselves. But no one left without looking back at that ditch, at the spot where the girl had been found. Questions filled the air, lingering like a shadow. Later that evening, at the hospital, a doctor stood beside the girl's bed, watching her chest rise and fall with each slow, steady breath. She was still weak, but stable. A nurse had tried to ask her a few questions, but she had only blinked at them, as if she couldn't find the words or didn't want to. Meanwhile, in a local police station, the dog sat quietly in a makeshift pen, his head resting on his paws. A young officer stood nearby, watching him. "Where did you come from?" "Huh," he murmured. "And what do you know?" The dog didn't respond, of course. But something about the way he watched the officer, his intelligent eyes locked onto him, sent a shiver down the man's spine. Across town, a radio crackled. Still no reports of a missing girl. A voice on the other end said. The officer who had found her ran a hand down his face. Somebody has to be looking for her. But deep down, he wasn't sure. Because if someone was searching for this child, why hadn't they come forward? The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. The girl lay motionless, her small frame barely making an imprint on the bed. The nurses had done everything they could, hydrated her, bandaged the small scrapes on her arms and legs, and wrapped her in a warm blanket. But still, she hadn't spoken. Not a single word. The officer who had found her stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her carefully. Something wasn't adding up. A lost child should be scared, asking for their parents, desperate to go home. But this girl, she just stared at the ceiling, her eyes vacant, almost as if she was somewhere else entirely. The woman who had followed the dog was sitting beside the bed. She had been there for hours, hoping the girl would say something, anything, but the silence between them felt heavier than words ever could. She reached out carefully, placing a gentle hand over the girl's. "You're safe now," she whispered. "Whatever happened, you don't have to be afraid anymore." For a moment, she thought she saw something in the girl's eyes, recognition, maybe even trust, but then it was gone, replaced by that same empty stare. Down at the police station, the dog lay curled up in the corner of his pen, his tail wrapped around himself. He had refused food, barely moved since he was brought in. It was as if he knew something was still wrong. The young officer from before leaned against the metal bars, watching him closely. "You didn't just find her by accident, did you?" he muttered. "You were looking for help." The dog's ears flicked, but he didn't lift his head. The officer sighed and turned back to his desk, flipping through missing person reports from surrounding counties. If the girl wasn't from this town, maybe someone from another area had reported her missing. But as he scrolled through page after page, a cold realization settled over him. There was nothing. No one matching her description. No reports, no alerts. It was like she didn't exist. A sudden noise broke the silence. A sharp bark, urgent and desperate. The officer's head snapped up just in time to see the dog standing, tense and alert, his eyes locked on the window. "What is it?" he asked, stepping closer. Another bark, then a growl, low and warning. The officer turned to follow the dog's gaze, but outside, everything looked normal. Just a quiet street, the occasional car passing by. But the dog didn't relax. His muscles were still tight, his body rigid with an unease the officer could feel in his own chest. Back at the hospital, the woman shifted in her chair, glancing at the clock. It was late. Too late. The police had promised to keep looking for answers, but without a missing person report, there wasn't much to go on. The girl had no ID, no belongings, no sign of where she had come from or how she had ended up in that ditch. She sighed, rubbing her hands together. "You must be so tired," she murmured. The girl blinked slowly, then, for the first time, turned her head slightly, just enough to look at the woman directly. It was such a small movement, but it sent a chill down the woman's spine. Because the girl's eyes, they weren't just tired. They weren't just blank. They were filled with fear. A shiver crawled over the woman's skin. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "is someone looking for you?" The girl didn't nod. She didn't shake her head. She just gripped the blanket a little tighter. And that was when the hospital lights flickered. The woman's breath caught as the overhead lights flickered again, casting long shadows against the hospital walls. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor remained steady, but something in the air shifted, an uneasy tension pressing down on her chest. The girl's fingers tightened around the blanket, knuckles white, her eyes darting toward the door. Outside the room, a nurse hesitated in the hallway, looking up at the flickering lights. A few other staff members exchanged glances, but the disturbance lasted only a moment before everything returned to normal. Just a power fluctuation, nothing more. But in the quiet of the room, the woman noticed something else. Footsteps. Soft, measured, stopping just outside the door. The girl's breathing quickened. The woman turned her head slightly, listening. A shadow passed briefly under the crack of the door, then disappeared. The hallway remained silent. She swallowed, forcing herself to stay calm. "It's all right," she whispered, placing a gentle hand over the girl's. "You're safe here." The girl looked at her, her lips parted as if she wanted to say something. But before she could, a firm knock echoed through the room. The woman's heart jumped. A nurse poked her head in. "Sorry to interrupt," she said kindly. "A police officer is here. You want to check in on her." The girl's whole body tensed. The woman turned toward the nurse. "Which officer?" "The one who found her, I believe." That was a relief. The woman nodded, forcing a small smile. "All right, send him in." The girl flinched as the door opened, but when the officer from earlier stepped inside, her rigid posture softened slightly. He approached slowly, keeping his voice gentle. "Hey kid," he said. "Just wanted to see how you're doing." She didn't respond, but at least she was looking at him now. The woman sighed. Still no name. She hasn't spoken at all. The officer nodded, his expression serious. "We've been digging. There's still no missing person report matching her description. But we found something strange." He paused, glancing at the girl before lowering his voice. There were footprints near the ditch. More than just hers. The woman felt a cold chill creep down her spine. So, she wasn't alone. The officer shook his head. Someone else was out there. He hesitated, and they might still be looking for her. The girl suddenly shifted, clutching the woman's sleeve. The officer immediately crouched to her level, keeping his voice soft. "Do you know who it was?" Her lips parted, a barely there movement. The woman's heart pounded. Was this it? Was she finally going to speak? The girl's voice was barely above a whisper. "They're coming." The room went silent. The woman and the officer exchanged uneasy glances. "Who's coming?" the officer asked carefully. The girl didn't answer. She just stared at the door, her eyes wide and full of something between fear and exhaustion. The officer straightened, his hand instinctively resting on his radio. "I'll have extra patrols outside the hospital," he assured. "No one's getting in here that shouldn't be." The woman reached for the girl's hand again. "You're safe now," she repeated, hoping this time the girl would believe it. The night passed with quiet tension. A patrol car sat outside the hospital, officers watching for anything unusual. The dog, still at the station, had settled down but remained alert, ears twitching at every distant sound. By morning, there had been no sign of anyone suspicious, no indication that the girl's warning had meant anything. The officer returned, hoping for more answers, but she had fallen into a deep sleep, exhausted from whatever she had been through. Later that day, a breakthrough finally came. Another police department, miles away, contacted them after hearing the description of the girl over the radio. A missing child report had been filed, not locally, but in a town nearly 3 hours from Maplewood. The details were limited, but enough to confirm the truth. The girl had been taken from her home days earlier. Somehow, she had escaped, making it all the way to that ditch on her own. And the dog. No one knew where he had come from or why he had been the one to find her, but without him, she might never have been saved. The news spread quickly. People in the small town, who had once been strangers to the girl, now felt fiercely protective of her. The woman, who had followed the dog that morning, stayed by her side until arrangements were made for her to be reunited with her family. When the time finally came for her to leave, she hesitated, looking at the woman, then at the officer, and finally at the dog, who had been brought to see her one last time. He wagged his tail slightly, stepping closer, pressing his nose to her hand. For the first time, a small smile appeared on her lips. The woman bent down beside her. "He saved you," she said softly. "Maybe he was meant to." The girl looked at the dog, then back at her and nodded. As she was guided toward the car that would take her home, she turned one last time. Her voice was quiet but clear. "Thank you." And just like that, she was gone. The town would never forget that morning. The stray dog, the ditch, the girl who appeared out of nowhere. But most of all, They wouldn't forget the way everything had changed because of a single animal who refused to give up. The woman watched as the dog sat there, staring after the car long after it had disappeared. She reached out, running a gentle hand over his head. "Looks like you found your home, too." And for the first time, the dog leaned into her touch, as if he already knew.